The rain hammered against the hospital window like accusations, each drop a reminder of all the ways she'd failed. Sarah pressed her forehead against the cold glass, watching the parking lot blur through her tears. Somewhere in this building, behind sterile doors and antiseptic smells, her daughter was fighting for her life. And somewhere out there, in the darkness beyond the rain, was the person who could save her. A stranger. Someone she'd never met. Someone who didn't owe them anything. Sarah had spent 3 weeks praying for a miracle, and now that it might finally come, she couldn't stop thinking about one terrible question. What kind of person gives away a piece of themselves to save someone they've never known? The answer walked through the hospital doors at 6:47 a.m. wearing a faded denim jacket and carrying a backpack that had seen better days. Her name was Maya Rodriguez, and she looked nothing like the angel Sarah had imagined. She was young, maybe 25, with dark circles under her eyes and hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. She walked with the slouched shoulders of someone who'd worked a double shift, which, Sarah would learn later, she had. Maya had seen the donor registry form tucked into her employee newsletter at the diner where she worked. Most people threw those newsletters away without reading them. Maya almost had to. She'd been collecting ketchup bottles from empty tables, her feet aching in shoes with worn-out soles, thinking about how she was going to make rent this month. The newsletter had fallen out of her apron pocket, and when she'd bent to pick it up, her eyes had caught on a single word: hero. Be someone's hero, the flyer had read. Join the bone marrow registry today. Maya had laughed, a bitter sound that made the cook look up from the grill. Her? A hero? She was barely keeping her own life together. She'd dropped out of college when her mom got sick, worked 3 jobs to pay the medical bills that kept coming even after her mum died. She lived in a basement apartment that flooded when it rained hard, ate ramen for dinner most nights, and hadn't been able to afford new clothes in 2 years. Heroes were people who had their lives figured out. Heroes were people who had something to give. But she'd filled out the form anyway, swabbed the inside of her cheek during her break, mailed it in and completely forgotten about it. Until 6 months later, when they called to tell her she was a match. A 10-year-old girl named Emma, acute lymphoblastic leukemia, without a transplant, maybe 6 months to live. With it, a fighting chance at growing up, going to middle school, learning to drive, falling in love, becoming whoever she was meant to be. You don't have to do this, the coordinator had told Maya over the phone. I need you to understand that. You can say number. Maya had looked around her tiny apartment, at the water stain on the ceiling that looked like a map of somewhere better, at the acceptance letter from UCLA she'd kept even though she'd never be able to go back. She'd thought about her mom, about how she'd give anything to have saved her, about how someone, somewhere, was about to lose their child, and for once in her life, Maya actually had the power to stop it. When? Was all she'd said. The procedure wasn't easy. They'd explained that to her, made sure she understood. Extracting bone marrow wasn't like donating blood. There would be pain, recovery time, risks. She'd have to miss work, probably lose her shifts at the diner. She couldn't afford any of that. She'd said yes anyway. Now, walking into the hospital at dawn, Maya felt the weight of what she'd agreed to settle over her shoulders. She was scared, more scared than she wanted to admit. But she kept thinking about that little girl, about how someone loved her so much they were probably falling apart right now, and that kept her feet moving forward. Sarah saw Maya check in at the nurse's station. She watched this stranger fill out forms, answer questions, laugh nervously at something the nurse said. Sarah had imagined this moment 100 times, imagined running up to this person, falling at their feet, crying, thanking them until the words lost all meaning. But now that the moment was here, she found she couldn't move. How do you thank someone for giving your child their life back? The answer was, You couldn't. There were no words big enough. Emma had been diagnosed on a Tuesday. Sarah remembered because she'd been planning Emma's birthday party. Had just ordered a cake shaped like a stack of books because Emma loved reading more than anything. Instead of a party, they'd spent Emma's 10th birthday in a hospital room, listening to a doctor explain words like blast cells and chemotherapy and donor match. They'd tested everyone: Sarah, Emma's father, grandparents, cousins. No one was compatible. Emma's best chance was finding an unrelated donor, someone who'd registered and happened to be a genetic match. The odds weren't good. For mixed-race families like theirs, the odds were even worse. Sarah had spent months watching her daughter get sicker, watching the light dim in eyes that used to sparkle with curiosity, watching her lose her hair, her energy, her hope. Emma had stopped talking about the future, stopped making plans. At 10 years old, she'd learned to live in the present because the future felt like a luxury she couldn't afford to imagine. And then the call had come. They'd found a match. Maya was prepped for surgery by 8 a.m. The anesthesiologist explained what would happen, how she'd feel afterward. Maya nodded, signed more forms, changed into a hospital gown that was too big and too cold. She thought about calling someone, but there wasn't anyone to call. No family left, and her friends didn't know she was doing this. She told her boss she had the flu. "You okay, honey?" An older nurse named Patricia touched Maya's shoulder, and Maya realized she was crying. "I'm scared," Maya whispered. "Of course you are," Patricia said. "But you know what? That little girl upstairs, she's been scared for months. And today, because of you, she gets to stop being scared. You're doing something most people only dream about doing. You're giving a child her future back." Patricia didn't know that Maya had lost hers. Didn't know about the dropped classes, the buried dreams, the life that could have been. Maya almost told her, almost said that she wasn't anyone special, wasn't anyone's hero. But then she thought about Emma's mom. About how that woman must have spent every night for months lying awake, bargaining with God, with the universe, with anyone who might be listening. "Okay," Maya said, "I'm ready." The surgery took 3 hours. Sarah spent every minute in the waiting room, pacing, praying, making deals with a higher power she wasn't sure she believed in. Emma's father sat with his head in his hands. Emma's grandparents held each other. And somewhere, in an operating room, a stranger was having her bones pierced with needles so that Emma might live. When it was over, when the nurse came to tell them it had gone well, that they'd collected enough stem cells, that Maya was in recovery and stable, Sarah finally broke down. Great, gasping sobs that shook her whole body. Relief and gratitude and guilt all tangled together. Someone she'd never met had just endured hours of pain so her daughter could have a chance. How did you carry that knowledge? How did you live with owing someone absolutely everything? "Can I meet her?" Sarah asked when she could speak again. "The donor? Can I thank her?" The nurse shook her head gently. "The program is anonymous. She's requested no contact." Sarah felt her heart crack. She'd never know the person who saved Emma's life. Never be able to look her in the eye and say thank you. Never be able to tell her that she'd given them hope when they had none left. This stranger would walk out of the hospital and back into her own life, and Sarah would never see her again. But Sarah did see her, just once. She was walking to Emma's room when she passed by the recovery area. Through a partially open door, she saw a young woman sitting up in a hospital bed, still groggy from anesthesia, eating jello and watching the rain. There was something about her, some instinct that made Sarah stop. This was her. Sarah knew it the way you know some truths in your bones. The woman looked up and their eyes met for just a second. Sarah saw everything in that moment. Saw the weariness, the pain, the fear. But she also saw something else. A quiet strength. A choice made not because it was easy, but because it was right. Sarah pressed her hand against her heart and then held it out, palm open. A silent gesture of gratitude that carried everything words couldn't hold. The woman in the bed smiled, a small, tired smile, and nodded. And then Sarah walked away, because respecting this stranger's privacy was the only thing she could give her in return. Emma received the transplant the next day. The stem cells from Maya's bones traveled through 4 lines into Emma's bloodstream, carrying the promise of new life. It would be weeks before they'd know if it worked, months before Emma would be out of danger. But for the first time in a long time, Sarah let herself hope. Maya left the hospital the following morning, sore and exhausted, taking the bus back to her flooded apartment and her minimum wage jobs and her life that no one would ever call remarkable. She'd lost 2 weeks of wages, would probably have to skip meals to make rent, would work double shifts for the next month to catch up. She'd do it all again in a heartbeat. 3 months later, Emma's tests came back clear. The donor cells had engrafted. She was going to make it. Sarah cried for an hour straight, holding her daughter while Emma laughed and rolled her eyes the way 10-year-olds do, already looking ahead to all the tomorrows she'd been given back. "Mom," Emma said that night, when Sarah was tucking her in, "I know you can't tell me anything about the donor, but do you think she knows that it worked?" Sarah thought about the woman in the hospital bed, about her worn-out shoes and tired eyes and extraordinary heart. "I hope so, baby, I really hope so." The program did notify Maya, a brief letter that said the recipient was doing well, that the transplant had been successful, that she'd helped save a life. Maya read it 3 times, then tucked it into the frame of her bathroom mirror where she'd see it every morning. On the days when everything felt hard, when the bills piled up and the future seemed impossible, she'd look at that letter and remember that she'd done something that mattered. She never knew Emma's name, never knew that Emma grew up to become a pediatric oncologist, inspired by the stranger who'd saved her life. Never knew that Emma spent her career giving other children the gift she'd been given, the chance to grow up. But Maya knew something else. She knew that heroism wasn't about having everything figured out or having resources to spare or living a remarkable life. She knew that sometimes, the most profound act of love was showing up for a stranger when you had every reason not to. She knew that the power of humanity lived in those moments when someone chose kindness even when it cost them something. Years later, Maya would finally make it back to college, would graduate, would build a life she was proud of, and she'd carry with her always the knowledge that once, when it mattered most, she'd been brave enough to give a piece of herself to save someone she'd never know. In a world that often felt too hard, too cruel, too broken, Maya had learned the most important truth, that one person's selfless choice could change everything. That we save each other. That love, in its purest form, asks nothing in return. Title her a hero? The world never would. Her name would never make headlines or appear in history books. But somewhere, a young woman who'd been given the gift of life would grow up knowing that strangers could be angels, that humanity could be beautiful, that someone out there had loved her enough to hurt for her. And really, what greater story is there to tell than that?